The distress beacon had been screaming into the void for 11 days before anyone heard it, and even then, only one ship changed course. Sergeant Elias Cade sat in the cockpit of the drifter's compass, staring at the blinking red dot on his navigation console, and he knew in his gut that whatever was waiting on that planet was something terrible, something no sane person would fly toward. But Elias had stopped being sane a long time ago. Probably around the time he watched 37 colonists burn alive on Mars Colony 7, while the evacuation shuttle lifted off without them, because some bureaucrat had decided the fuel cost was not worth the lives. Mara, the ship's artificial intelligence, spoke in her calm and measured tone, the way she always did when she was about to tell him something he did not want to hear. Elias, the beacon originates from Vaith Prime, which is currently under Galactic Concord Quarantine Code Absolute, and landing on a quarantined world carries penalties including seizure of vessel, indefinite detention, and in certain jurisdictions, summary execution. Elias leaned back in his chair and rubbed the scar that ran from his left ear to his jawline, a gift from a collapsing bulkhead on Mars. What kind of quarantine are we talking about? Cleansing Fire Protocol was enacted 14 days ago, and the planet has been subjected to full orbital bombardment designed to eliminate all biological life on the surface. He sat with that for a moment, and the silence in the cockpit was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest like a hand. And the beacon, still active, which suggests at least one structure with power remains intact, though the probability of survivors is calculated at less than 0.3%. So there is a chance. Elias, I must strongly advise against. Set the course, Mara. The ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel 40 minutes later, and the first thing Elias saw through the viewport was what remained of Vaith Prime, and the word that came to his mind was not destruction or devastation or any of those words that people use when they have never actually seen a world die. The word that came to his mind was silence, because even through the vacuum of space he could feel the absence of everything that had once lived there. The planet's surface glowed in patches of dull orange and angry red, where the bombardment had cracked the crust open like an egg, and rivers of molten rock crawled across what had once been cities and forests and oceans, and rising above it all were columns of ash so thick they looked like pillars holding up the sky. The Sithari had lived here, a species of slender silver-skinned beings whose bodies carried bioluminescent veins that pulsed with soft light like living constellations, and they had been poets and builders and dreamers, and now they were ash, declared genetically non-viable by the Galactic Concord's Committee on Species Viability, a name so clean and official that it almost hid the fact that it was a death sentence for an entire race. Elias brought the compass down through the atmosphere, and the ship shuddered and groaned as waves of heat battered the hull, and MARA reported that external temperatures were exceeding safe thresholds, and that the filtration system was struggling with the density of particulate matter in the air, which was her polite way of saying that the air outside was made of dead people. He landed in what the ship's database identified as the city of Vaithari, which had been the cultural heart of the Sithari civilization, home to their greatest temples and libraries and gathering halls, and now it looked like the inside of a furnace, everything reduced to jagged black shapes that jutted out of the ground like broken teeth. Elias sealed his helmet, checked his oxygen supply, and stepped out onto the surface of a dead world. The heat hit him first, even through the suit, a deep baking warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the ground beneath his boots and the air around him and the sky above, and then the smell hit him, filtered and dulled by his respirator but still there, the unmistakable smell of burning, not wood or metal or fuel but something organic, something that had once been alive. He followed the beacon signal through streets that no longer existed, stepping over rubble and around craters, and past shapes that he tried very hard not to look at too closely, because some of them were small, very small, And he had learned on Mars that there were things you could see that would live inside your skull forever and eat you from the inside out. The signal led him to what had once been a temple, a massive structure of curved walls and soaring arches that the Sithari had built to honor their ancestors, and most of it had collapsed, but one section still stood, leaning and cracked and groaning under the weight of its own ruin, and inside that section the beacon pulsed like a heartbeat. He climbed through a gap in the fallen wall and switched on his helmet light, and the beam cut through the dust and smoke and landed on something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Bodies, at least 12 of them, Sithari adults piled together in a circle, their silver skin blackened and cracked, their bioluminescent veins dark and dead, and they were all facing inward, all curled around a single point at the center. And Elias realized with a lurch in his stomach that they had done this on purpose. They had used their own bodies as shields. He moved closer, and his hands were shaking, and he pulled aside a fallen beam that must have weighed 200 pounds, but he did not feel it because the adrenaline was doing what adrenaline does. And beneath the beam, beneath the bodies, beneath the ash and the ruin of an entire civilization, he found her. She was small, so small that his first thought was that she could not possibly be alive, and she was curled into a ball with her four-fingered hands wrapped around her knees, and her silver skin was burned and blistered and covered in ash, and her bioluminescent veins were completely dark, which he would later learn was something the Sithari called a death mark, the sign that a body had given up. But her chest moved, just barely, a tiny rise and fall that was the most stubborn and defiant thing Elias Cade had ever seen in his life. He reached down and lifted her, and she weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of dry sticks wrapped in silk, and her eyes opened, and they were violet, wide, pupilless, and they stared at him with an expression that was not fear and not hope, and not anything he had a word for in any human language. It was the expression of someone who had already accepted the end and could not understand why it had not come. She did not scream and she did not cry. She just reached out with those four-fingered hands and gripped the front of his jacket, and her fingers locked into the fabric with a strength that seemed impossible for something so fragile, and she did not let go. Elias carried her back through the burning ruins of Vathari, and Mara was talking in his ear about structural instability and rising temperatures and approaching ash storms. But he was not listening because the only thing that mattered in the entire universe was the weight in his arms and the heartbeat he could feel through his suit, faint and fast and fighting. He was halfway to the ship when the conquered patrol drone found them, a sleek black machine that descended from the smoke like a mechanical vulture, and scanned them with a beam of blue light, and Mara intercepted its transmission and read it back to him in a voice that had gone very quiet. Scan complete, 1 human adult, 1 Sithari juvenile, species status. Extinct, biological asset flagged for retrieval, data transmitted to conquered relay network. Elias looked up at the drone, and the drone looked down at him with its single glowing eye, and he shifted the girl in his arms so that she was pressed against his chest and shielded by his body, and he walked past the drone without a word and did not look back. On the ship, he laid her down on the medical cot, and Mara began running scans, and the results were a long list of things that were wrong with her: malnutrition, dehydration, burns across 40% of her body, smoke damage to her respiratory system, acute psychological trauma, and at the bottom of the list Mara added a single note: species population 1. Elias wrapped her in a thermal blanket and sat beside her, and he did not know what to say because what do you say to the last of anything? And so he said nothing and she said nothing, and the ship hummed around them, and outside the viewport Vaith Prime burned. Then so faintly that he almost missed it, a flicker of light moved beneath her skin, a tiny pulse of blue-white luminescence that traveled up her arm and faded, and then another, and another, like stars being born in the darkness. Mara spoke softly. Elias, 17 intelligence networks have flagged this vessel, and I am detecting multiple long-range tracking signals, and I believe we have attracted significant attention." Elias looked down at the sleeping girl, at the faint constellation of light beginning to glow beneath her damaged skin, and he made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. Though he did not know it then, he only knew that he had found something alive in a place of death, and he was not going to let it go. Set course for Earth, MARA. Elias, the consequences of Earth, MARA, take us home. The drifter's compass lifted off from the ashes of Vaith Prime and turned its nose toward a small blue world on the far side of the galaxy, carrying a broken man and a dying girl and a truth that would bring empires to their knees. The journey from Vaith Prime to Earth took 9 days, and in those 9 days, Elias Cade learned 3 things about the girl he had pulled from the fire. The first thing he learned was that she would not eat, not because she did not want to, but because there was nothing on the ship that her body could process. And MARA spent 2 full days analyzing her biology and synthesizing a nutrient paste from base amino acids and mineral compounds that approximated Sithari food. And when Elias offered it to her on a small plate, she looked at it for a long time and then looked at him, and then looked back at the paste. And she ate it slowly and carefully, and without any expression at all. And Elias sat across from her and pretended to eat his own ration bar so she would not feel alone. The second thing he learned was that she understood far more than she could say, because on the 4th day she began to speak, not in Sithari but in broken galactic common, the trade language of the conquered, and her voice was soft and thin like paper tearing, and the first thing she said was his name, except she could not quite shape the sounds the way humans did, so it came out as Ayla's, and he did not correct her because he liked it better that way. The third thing he learned was that she already knew the answer to the question. She asked him on the 6th day when she sat on the edge of the medical cot with her feet dangling and her dark violet eyes fixed on his face, and said in her careful, halting way, "Are they all gone?" And it was not really a question. It was a confirmation. And Elias opened his mouth to say something kind or hopeful or gentle, and found that he could not lie to those eyes, so he simply nodded, and she nodded back. And that was the moment he understood that this child had a kind of strength that he had never encountered in any species, including his own. On the 9th day, the drifter's compass entered the Sol system and was immediately hailed by 3 separate authorities: the United Nations Space Command, the Orbital Defense Network, and a galactic conquered diplomatic vessel that had been waiting at the system's edge like a spider at the corner of its web. MARA handled the human communications while Elias handled the girl, wrapping her in a clean blanket and carrying her to the cockpit so she could see Earth through the viewport. And when the blue and white sphere came into view, Kale pressed her hands against the glass, and her bioluminescent veins pulsed with a light he had not seen before, something bright and warm that traveled across her skin in waves. And she whispered a word in Sithari that MARA translated as alive. They docked at Threshold Station, the massive orbital platform that served as humanity's gateway to the wider galaxy, and Elias carried Kale down the boarding ramp and into a corridor filled with people who were trying very hard to look professional and calm and completely failing, because word had already spread. The Salvager and the last Sithari were the most talked-about beings in the galaxy. Director Lena Vasquez was waiting for them, a tall woman with sharp dark eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back tight, and she was the head of Earth's Office of Xenorelations, which meant she was the person responsible for making sure humanity did not accidentally start a war with any of the thousands of species that considered humans to be loud and reckless and dangerously young. And right now, she was looking at Elias and the girl in his arms, and calculating the political cost of what he had done with the speed and precision of a supercomputer. "Sergeant Cade," she said, and her voice was controlled and even, "do you understand what you have brought to our doorstep?" "A kid," Elias said. "I brought a kid." Before Vasquez could respond, the corridor filled with the heavy sound of armored boots, and a squad of Torvathi soldiers appeared at the far end, tall insectoid beings in glossy black armor with mandibles that clicked when they spoke, and at their head walked Ambassador Rivon Sot, whose compound eyes reflected the light in a way that made it impossible to tell where he was looking. "On behalf of the Galactic Concord," Sot said in a voice like dry leaves scraping across stone, "I am here to collect the remaining Sithari biological asset for processing and archival in accordance with Cleansing Protocol 7. The word asset landed in the corridor like a grenade, and Elias felt Kale's hands tighten on his jacket, and her bioluminescence dimmed the way it did when she was frightened, and something inside Elias Cade that had been coiled and waiting since Mars Colony 7 finally snapped into place like a round being chambered. "She is not an asset," he said. "She is a child, and you are not taking her anywhere." Sot tilted his angular head and made a clicking sound that Mara translated as mild amusement, and he gestured to one of his soldiers, a massive Torvathi who stepped forward and reached one clawed hand toward Kale. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds and was captured in perfect clarity by 6 different security cameras on Threshold Station. And within 1 hour, the footage had been transmitted to every corner of the known galaxy. Elias shifted Kale to his left arm, caught the Torvathi soldier's reaching hand with his right, twisted his body with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years in combat training, and broke the soldier's arm in 3 places. The sound was like thick branches snapping in winter, and the soldier went down with a shriek that echoed through the corridor, and Elias was already stepping back with Kale pressed against his chest. His eyes locked on Sot with an expression that was not anger and not fear, but something far more dangerous. It was absolute certainty. The other Torvathi soldiers raised their weapons, and Vasquez shouted for them to stand down, and station security poured in from both ends of the corridor. And for a long, terrible moment, everyone stood frozen with their hands on triggers and their hearts in their throats. And in the middle of it all, captured by the cameras that were already broadcasting to a galaxy of billions, stood a bleeding human man holding a tiny silver girl who was clinging to his leg with her face pressed against his hip, and her bioluminescent veins pulsing in rapid, terrified patterns. The footage spread like fire through dry grass. It hit the galactic net and it multiplied, translated into 11,000 languages and shared across hundreds of worlds. And on each of those worlds, beings of every shape and size and biology watched a human stand between armed soldiers and a child and refuse to move. And something shifted in the collective consciousness of the galaxy, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. In Geneva, in the United Nations Interstellar Affairs Building, Director Vasquez stood before the Security Council and spoke for 47 minutes, and she laid out the legal framework and the political consequences and the military realities. And then she set all of that aside and said what she had really come to say. "The Concord calls her a biological asset," Vasquez said. "They want to finish what they started on Vaith Prime. They want to erase the last trace of the Sithari from existence, and they are legally entitled to do so under Concord law. And we are a minor species with a small fleet and no leverage. And the smart thing to do would be to hand her over and apologize, and hope they do not punish us too severely." She paused and looked around the room at the faces of the people, who represented 8 billion human beings. "But I am not here to recommend the smart thing. I am here to recommend the right thing. And the right thing is Article 7 of the Interstellar Compact, the right of sanctuary, which states that any species may grant asylum to a refugee if they accept full custodial responsibility and full consequences, and I am recommending that Earth claim this child." The vote was unanimous. Every single hand in that room went up. And there were some who had tears on their faces, and some who were pale with fear, and some who were both, but not one hand stayed down. Earth claimed Kale. The Concord's response came within the hour, delivered by Ambassador Sot in a transmission that was broadcast on every official channel, and it was exactly what Vasquez had expected. The Galactic Concord recognizes Earth's invocation of Article 7 and considers it a violation of cleansing protocol and an obstruction of lawful species management. Earth is given 72 hours to surrender the Sithari biological asset. Failure to comply will result in corrective measures proportional to the offense. Everyone in the room understood what corrective measures meant. It meant warships. It meant the same fire that had consumed Vaith Prime turned toward Earth. It meant the Concord had just threatened to burn humanity's home. And in a quiet room on Threshold Station, behind a locked door guarded by 4 soldiers who had volunteered for the duty without being asked, Elias Cade sat on the floor with his back against the wall and watched Kale draw on a datapad. She drew with intense focus, her small fingers moving across the screen with a precision that seemed too old for her age, and the images she created were crude but unmistakable. A world on fire, falling figures, ash and darkness, and then one figure standing upright among the flames, a figure with no bioluminescence, a figure that was shaped like him. She looked up from the datapad and met his eyes, and her violet gaze was steady and clear. And she spoke in English, real English, not Galactic Common, words she had been practicing in secret during the 9 days on the ship, listening to MARA's language files while Elias thought she was sleeping. "You stayed," she said, and the 2 words carried the weight of everything she had lost and everything she had found. And Elias Cade, who had not cried since Mars Colony 7, felt something crack open in his chest that he had kept sealed shut for years. "Yeah, kid," he said, and his voice was rough and broken and human. "I stayed." Outside the station, beyond the thin shell of metal and light that separated them from the void, the conquered armada had already begun to move. 12,000 warships turning their bows toward a small blue world that had just drawn a line in the stars and dared the most powerful empire in the galaxy to cross it. The conquered armada entered the Sol system on the morning of the 3rd day, and it came not as a fleet but as a wall, 12,000 warships arranged in a formation that stretched across the darkness between Mars and Jupiter like a curtain being drawn across a window, and each ship was the size of a city, bristling with weapons that could crack moons and boil oceans. And their combined mass was so great that the gravitational sensors on Earth's outer monitoring stations registered them as a small celestial event. Fleet Admiral Unipark stood on the bridge of the UNSS Defiance, humanity's flagship, and she looked at the tactical display that showed the incoming fleet as a solid red wave. And then she looked at the blue dots that represented Earth's defense force, 214 ships arranged in a protective shell around the planet, and the math was simple and terrible, 60-1. Her executive officer, Commander Tors, stood beside her with a face the color of old paper. "Admiral, at current approach speed, they will be in weapons range in 11 hours. Park nodded and took a slow breath and straightened her uniform, which was a habit she had developed at the Academy 30 years ago, when she learned that the people under your command will mirror your body language whether they know it or not. And if you stand like you expect to win, then they will fight like they expect to win. "Signal all ships," she said. "Defensive formation Omega, nothing gets past us. Admiral, with respect, our shields cannot withstand sustained fire from." "I know the math, Tors. Signal all ships." On Earth below, something was happening that the Conquered had not predicted and could not have understood even if they had. Because the Conquered was an empire built on obedience and hierarchy, and the fundamental belief that smaller species would always submit to larger ones because that was the rational thing to do, and they had never encountered a species for whom rationality was not the highest priority. Every nation on Earth committed its full military capacity within 6 hours of the ultimatum, not after debates and negotiations and votes, but immediately, as if a switch had been thrown, and factories that had been producing consumer goods retooled overnight to manufacture shield generators and hull plating. and civilian cargo ships were fitted with weapons and crewed by volunteers who had never fired anything larger than a hunting rifle, but who showed up at the recruitment centers with their jaws set and their eyes steady, and said the same thing over and over: "Where do you need me?" Scientists who had spent their careers competing with each other for funding and recognition abandoned their rivalries and crowded into shared laboratories and worked in shifts around the clock to upscale shield technology and weapon systems. And they made breakthroughs in days that would have taken years under normal circumstances, because desperation is the mother of genius, and there is nothing more desperate than protecting your home. The footage of Elias and Kale continued to burn its way across the galaxy, translated now into 11,000 languages, and on world after world, beings who had watched the conquered destroy civilizations and said nothing began to speak, and then they began to shout, and then they began to break things. On the Torvathi labor worlds, where millions of indentured workers from conquered species toiled in conditions that would have made a human weep, the workers stopped working, not slowly or gradually, but all at once, and the Torvathi overseers found themselves standing in silent factories and empty fields staring at a workforce that had simply decided, collectively and without discussion, that they were finished. On the Kelesi trading stations, merchants refused to process conquered supply orders, and conquered warships that needed fuel and ammunition found their accounts frozen and their docking requests denied, and the great logistical machine that kept the conquered's military functioning began to stutter and choke. And in the heart of it all, in a region of space that had been silent for 300 years, something ancient stirred. The Drenathi sovereignty had been old when most of the conquered's member species were still learning to make fire, and they had once been the galaxy's greatest civilization, builders of wonders and keepers of knowledge. And then the conquered had come for them, not with a cleansing fire but with something almost worse, a slow economic and political strangulation that had pushed them to the margins of galactic society, and then beyond, into a self-imposed exile behind borders that no one crossed. The Hollow King, ruler of the Drenathi, had not spoken to anyone outside his borders in 3 centuries, and his people had become myths, ghost stories that spacers told in bars, the silent giants who watched the galaxy from their sealed domain and judged it and found it wanting. But the Hollow King had been watching the broadcasts, and he had seen the footage of a human man standing in fire, and he had seen the footage of that same man breaking a soldier's arm to protect a child, and something had moved inside his ancient crystalline body, something that felt like memory, because the Drenathi remembered what it was like to be hunted. They remembered the fear and the helplessness and the terrible knowledge that no one was coming, and they remembered that no one had come for them. Until now someone had come for someone else. On Threshold Station, Elias was pulled into a meeting with a group of politicians who looked like they had not slept in days, and their fear filled the room like smoke, and they told him in careful and reasonable words that the situation had become untenable, and that perhaps it would be best for everyone, including the girl, if they reconsidered their position. Elias listened, and then he said no, and they explained again with more urgency, and he said no again, and they raised their voices, and he stood up and looked at them and said, "I pulled her out of a fire, I am not putting her back in one." And then a voice came from the doorway, small and clear and steady, and everyone turned to look at Kale, who stood there in clothes that were too big for her with her silver skin, still marked by healing burns, and her violet eyes moving from face to face, with an understanding that no child should have to carry. She spoke in English, the English she had been teaching herself from Mara's files. And her accent was strange and beautiful, and every person in that room would remember her words for the rest of their lives. "My people are gone because no one stood," she said. "He stood, will you?" Nobody in the room spoke for a long time after that. 11 hours after entering the Sol system, the conquered armada reached weapons range of Earth, and 12,000 warships armed their batteries and locked their targeting systems onto the blue planet below, and the moment hung in the silence of space like a drop of water at the edge of a leaf. Admiral Park opened a communication channel, but not to the conquered fleet. She opened it to everything, every relay, every frequency, every receiver on every world in the known galaxy. And when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, and carried no hatred and no fear, only a simple and absolute truth. This is Fleet Admiral Unipark of the United Nations Space Command, speaking to the Galactic Conquered and to every being in every system who is listening. 9 days ago, one of our people found a child in a fire that you lit, and he carried her out. And when you came to take her back, we said no. And you have brought your warships to our home to take her by force, and I want to be very clear about what happens next. She paused, and in that pause the galaxy held its breath. We will not give her back. You may have more ships, you may have more guns, but you will not have her. And you will not have us, not today, not ever. If you want this child, you will have to come through every single one of us, and we will make you pay for every inch in blood and fire and fury, because that is what humans do. We do not abandon our own, and she is ours now. The transmission ended, and for a moment there was nothing, just the cold, empty silence of space and the distant light of uncaring stars. And then, at the edge of the Sol system, space itself seemed to crack open like an egg, and from the fracture poured light, and from the light came ships, 6,000 Drenathi warships emerging from fold space in a formation so precise it looked like a single organism, each ship a cathedral of crystal and metal that dwarfed even the Conquered's largest vessels, and they burned with an inner light that was ancient and terrible and beautiful. The Hollow King broke 300 years of silence with a single broadcast that reached every corner of the galaxy, and his voice was deep and resonant, and carried the weight of centuries of watching and waiting. We remember the fire, we remember what it is to burn alone, and we will not allow it again. We stand with Earth. The galaxy erupted. Within the hour, 14 more species sent ships, small fleets that blinked into existence at the edges of the Sol system like candles being lit in a dark room, and then 30 more came, and then 50, and then 80, and each one announced itself with the same simple declaration: we stand with Earth. They came from everywhere, from the margins and the shadows and the forgotten corners of the galaxy, species that the Conquered had bullied and threatened and ignored, species that had watched the cleansing fires burn and felt ashamed of their own silence. And now they came, not because they were strong, but because a human had shown them that strength was not about power. It was about what you refused to let go of. The Conquered fleet, assembled to crush a single minor world, found itself surrounded by an armada it had never imagined possible. And on the bridge of the Conquered flagship Axiom of Law, High Judiciary Oremex stood in his physical form for the first time in living memory, and he was smaller than anyone had expected, a pale, thin creature with too many eyes. And he stared at the sensor displays, showing the growing coalition with an expression that might have been disbelief, or might have been something older and deeper, and more terrible. His aide approached and asked for orders, and Oremex did not answer because he was watching something on his personal screen, a clip that had been playing on a loop since the day it first appeared on the galactic net, a human man pulling a silver girl from the ashes of a dead world. And in that moment, the most powerful being in the galaxy understood something that all his power and all his authority and all his ships could not protect him from. He understood that he was afraid. The standoff held for 2 days, and during those 2 days the space around Earth became the most crowded region in galactic history, warships from 100 species hanging in the void like ornaments on a tree, their weapons armed and their shields raised, and their crews staring across the darkness at each other. And every single being in that vast congregation knew that one mistake, one nervous gunner, one misread signal would turn the Sol system into a graveyard. On the Conquered flagship Axiom of Law, High Judiciary Oremex paced the corridors of his ship like a caged animal, and for the first time in his long and ruthless career, he faced a problem that could not be solved by force or law or the cold machinery of bureaucratic extermination, because the coalition surrounding his fleet was growing by the hour, and his own captains were sending him private messages asking if perhaps a diplomatic solution might be preferable, which was their polite way of saying they did not want to die for the right to kill one child. On Threshold Station, Elias sat with Kale in the medical bay, while a man named Dr. Emeka Osai knelt in front of her and spoke to her in a voice so gentle it sounded like a lullaby. And Osai was a xenolinguist, one of the best on Earth, a quiet man from Accra who had spent 20 years studying the languages and neural patterns of non-human species, and he had been brought to the station because of something Mara had detected during her medical scans of Kale. Something buried deep in the girl's neural architecture that was not part of her natural biology. It is an imprint, Mara had explained to Elias, a deliberate encoding of information into the neural pathways, consistent with a Sithari cultural practice documented in pre-cleansing academic records. In times of existential threat, Sithari elders would encode critical knowledge into the minds of their children, preserving it beyond their own deaths. Kale is carrying something, Elias, something her people wanted to survive. Osai had brought equipment that could interface with Sithari neural patterns, and he had explained to Kale in simple, clear words what he believed was inside her mind, and asked if she would allow him to help bring it out. And Kale had looked at Elias, and Elias had looked back at her and nodded, and she had said yes. The process was not easy. Kale sat in a chair with sensors attached to her temples, and as Osai carefully activated the neural interface, the girl's body went rigid and her eyes widened, and her bioluminescence flared so bright that everyone in the room had to shield their eyes. And then she began to speak, but not in her own voice, in voices that were older and deeper, and full of a grief so vast it seemed to fill the room like water. She spoke in Sithari, rapid and fluid, and Mara translated in real time. And what came out of that small silver girl's mouth over the next 3 hours changed the history of the galaxy. The Sithari had been explorers before they were anything else, and in the decades before the cleansing, they had sent expeditions to the oldest and most remote regions of the galaxy, searching for traces of the Ethan, the founding species of the Galactic Concord who had supposedly ascended to a higher plane of existence thousands of years ago, leaving behind only their laws and their institutions and the legend of their transcendence. The Ethan were the foundation of everything, every law the Concord enforced, every protocol it followed, every justification for its authority flowed from the myth that the Ethan had created a perfect system of governance, and then departed, entrusting it to their successors. And this myth was taught on every world and woven into every treaty and repeated so often and so confidently that no one questioned it. The Sithari questioned it. On a dead world at the edge of mapped space, a Sithari expedition found the ruins of an Ethan city, and inside that city they found what no one was ever supposed to find, the truth. The Ethan had not ascended, they had been destroyed. They had been the first species subjected to the cleansing fire, murdered by the very council they had created, because the Ethan had grown too powerful, too knowledgeable, too difficult to control, and the other founding species, the ones who now sat at the top of the Concord's hierarchy, had decided that the only way to secure their own dominance was to eliminate the Ethan entirely and rewrite history to claim they had simply left. The cleansing fire protocol was not created to remove genetically non-viable species. That was the lie. The cleansing fire was created to destroy any species that grew powerful enough to threaten the ruling caste, and it had been used again and again over thousands of years, each time with a different justification, each time erasing an entire people and adding their name to the list of species that had simply failed to thrive. The Sithari found the proof, star charts showing Ethan settlements that had been bombarded from orbit, genetic records proving the Ethan were not transcendent beings, but ordinary biological creatures who had been slaughtered, encrypted distress signals from Ethan's ships begging for help that never came, and archaeological evidence showing that the ascension narrative had been fabricated within a single generation of the genocide. The Sithari had tried to share this discovery with the conquered, because they were scholars and they believed in truth, and they believed that surely even the conquered would want to know the truth about its own origins. They were wrong. The conquered's response was the cleansing fire on Vaith Prime, the fastest and most thorough burning in recorded history, designed not to purge a non-viable species, but to silence the only people who knew the truth. But the Sithari had known what was coming. Their elders had seen the ships gathering in orbit, and in the final hours before the fire fell they had done the only thing they could do. They had taken everything they knew, every piece of evidence, every record, every scrap of proof, and they had encoded it into the mind of a child young enough to survive the encoding process. And then they had wrapped their bodies around her and burned so that she would not. Kale was not just the last Sithari. She was a living archive, a walking library of the truth that the conquered had killed billions to conceal. When the last of the encoded memories had been translated, the room was silent, and Kale was trembling in her chair, tears running down her silver cheeks, her bioluminescence pulsing in jagged, broken patterns, and she looked at Elias with her violet eyes and said in a voice that was small and raw and entirely her own, "They died so I could remember." Elias wrapped his arms around her and held her while she cried, and over her shoulder he looked at Vasquez and Osai and the military officers who had been listening, and their faces carried the same expression, the dawning understanding that everything they knew about galactic civilization was built on a foundation of murder. Vasquez was the first to speak, and what she said was simple and precise and left no room for debate. "We broadcast everything now, all of it, to every world, every relay, every frequency." Ambassador Sote appeared on the station within the hour, moving with a speed that betrayed his desperation, and he requested a private meeting with Vasquez and spoke to her in a voice that had lost all of its dry composure and was now something close to begging. "The conquered is prepared to withdraw all forces from the Sol system immediately," he said. "Earth will be granted full sovereign status and elevated to premier partner tier. The girl will be left in your custody permanently. All records of this incident will be classified and sealed. All we ask is that the data be destroyed." Vasquez looked at him, and for a moment she felt something close to pity, because Sote was not evil. He was just a creature of the system, a product of the machine, and the machine was all he knew. "No," she said. "Director, you do not understand what will happen if—" "I understand exactly what will happen. The truth will come out." Sote's compound eyes clicked and shifted, and he left the room without another word. And 16 minutes later the conquered flagship transmitted an emergency order to 3 destroyers at the edge of the formation, and those 3 ships broke ranks and accelerated toward Threshold Station at attack speed. Admiral Park saw them coming on the tactical display, 3 red dots separating from the mass and burning hard toward Earth, and she understood instantly what they were doing. This was not an invasion. This was a surgical strike. Destroy the station, destroy the data, destroy the girl, and let the conquered claim it was a rogue action by overzealous officers. "All ships, weapons free on the incoming hostiles," Park commanded, and her voice carried the steady calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was almost relieved it had finally come. The Battle of Sol lasted 9 minutes. Earth's ships, outgunned and outmassed, threw themselves at the 3 conquered destroyers with a ferocity that defied every tactical model the conquered had ever developed, and the Drenathi fleet moved in from the flank with a precision that was almost musical, their crystal ships cutting through space like blades, and the coalition forces closed from every direction like a fist. The 3 destroyers were destroyed, broken apart and scattered across the void in pieces that would orbit Earth's sun for millennia. And when it was over, not a single coalition ship had been lost, because the rest of the conquered fleet had not fired, their captains watching the engagement from their bridges with their hands at their sides, and whether they did not fire because they chose not to or because they could not bring themselves to, was a question that historians would debate for generations. The broadcast went out 17 minutes after the last conquered destroyer was reduced to debris. Every relay in the galaxy carried it. Every world received it. Every species that had ever lived under the conquered's authority heard the truth about the Ethan, about the cleansing fire, about the lie at the foundation of their civilization. And the proof was undeniable. Star charts and genetic records and distress signals and archaeological data that could not be fabricated or dismissed. The effect was immediate and total. On the conquered's capital world, the governing council was surrounded by their own guards and placed under arrest before the broadcast had finished playing, and on 100 other worlds conquered officials found themselves facing crowds that were no longer afraid, and the machinery of empire that had run smoothly for thousands of years ground to a halt in a matter of hours because the machine only works when people believe in it, and no one believed anymore. On the bridge of the axiom of law, High Judiciary Oremex watched the sensor displays as his fleet fragmented around him, ships peeling away and going dark, captains who had served the conquered for decades simply turning off their transponders and drifting into the void, and his officers placed him in restraints, and he did not resist because there was nothing left to resist for. And on Threshold Station, in a room that smelled of tears and antiseptic and the faint ozone scent of Sithari bioluminescence, Kale stood at the viewport and watched the broadcast ripple across the galaxy in waves of light, and her veins blazed with a luminescence brighter than any Sithari in recorded history, so bright that she looked like a small silver star, and Elia stood beside her and held her hand, and neither of them spoke because some moments are too large for words. The Sithari were gone, and nothing could bring them back, but their truth was alive, carried in the mind of a child and spoken into the ears of every living being in the galaxy by a species that had looked at the fire and refused to look away. The galactic conquered did not fall to war, it fell to silence. In the 6 days following the broadcast, the most powerful institution in galactic history simply stopped functioning, not because it was conquered or overthrown or destroyed, but because the beings who had operated its machinery for thousands of years quietly and without ceremony stopped showing up. And it turned out that an empire built on a lie can only survive as long as people choose not to look at the lie too closely, and now everyone was looking. Conquered governors on 100 worlds woke to find their staff gone, their communications unanswered, their authority evaporated overnight like dew on hot metal, and some of them tried to reassert control and found that there was nothing to reassert control over because control is not a thing you can hold in your hands. It is a thing that exists only in the space between a command and its obedience, and the obedience was gone. The fleet that had come to Earth with 12,000 warships dissolved like sugar in water, ships breaking formation and scattering across the galaxy, some returning to their homeworlds, some drifting into deep space, some simply going dark and disappearing into the vast emptiness between the stars. And the great war that everyone had feared never happened because you cannot fight a war when your soldiers have decided they would rather be something else. On the 4th day after the broadcast, a message arrived at the United Nations from a coalition of 87 species, the same species that had sent their ships to stand with Earth during the standoff, and the message was not a demand or a treaty or an ultimatum. It was an invitation. They wanted to build something new, something to replace the conquered, not an empire but an assembly, a gathering of equals where no species would be cleansed and no truth would be buried, and they wanted to build it on Earth, and the reason they gave was simple, because Earth had shown them what the foundation should look like. Director Vasquez read the message 3 times and then sat alone in her office for 20 minutes staring at the wall, and when she came out her eyes were red but her back was straight, and she said yes. They held the founding session in Geneva because Geneva, was where humans had been trying to build institutions of peace for centuries, failing and trying again, and failing and trying again, with the stubborn persistence that was either humanity's greatest flaw or its greatest strength depending on who you asked. And the building they chose was old and imperfect, and had seen more arguments than agreements, which made it perfect for what was about to happen. They came from everywhere. Ships filled Earth's orbit until the night sky looked different, dotted with new lights that moved slowly among the stars, and shuttles descended through the atmosphere in an unending stream, carrying representatives from species that most humans had never seen and could barely pronounce the names of, and each one that stepped onto Earth's soil did so with a weight that went beyond gravity, because they were stepping into a new world in every sense of the word. The Drenathi were the first to arrive, because they had been the first to stand, and the Hollow King descended from his shuttle in the morning light of a Geneva dawn, and he was enormous, 12 feet tall, his body a lattice of living crystal that caught the sunlight and scattered it into rainbows that danced across the ground and the walls and the faces of the humans who stood watching in stunned silence. He walked through the streets of Geneva with footsteps that resonated like deep bells, and people lined the sidewalks and stared up at him with their mouths open, and children pointed and laughed because children have not yet learned to be afraid of things that are merely different. And the Hollow King looked down at the children, and something inside his ancient crystalline form pulsed with a light that the Drenathi would later describe as joy, a feeling their king had not experienced in 300 years. The assembly hall was filled beyond capacity, representatives seated and standing and hovering, and in one case clinging to the ceiling because that was how the Vexi Collective preferred to observe proceedings. And the noise was extraordinary. 1,000 different languages spoken and clicked and hummed and vibrated all at once. A symphony of difference that would have been chaos, except that beneath it all was a single shared understanding that they were here to do something that had never been done before. The Hollow King spoke first, and his voice filled the hall like the sound of a mountain learning to sing. For 300 years, my people hid behind our borders and told ourselves that the galaxy was not our concern, he said. And for 300 years we were wrong, and we were cowards, and the proof of our cowardice is written in the ashes of every world the conquered burned while we watched and did nothing. He paused, and the hall was so quiet that you could hear the heartbeat of the planet beneath the floor. But a human taught us something, he said. A human showed us that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something matters more than fear, and what matters more than fear is the child in the fire. It is always the child in the fire. And then the Hollow King, the ruler of the oldest civilization in the galaxy, the being who had not knelt before anything in 3 centuries, lowered his massive crystalline body to the ground and placed one hand on the floor of the assembly hall, and the light inside him blazed, and he pledged the Drenathi sovereignty to the new galactic assembly. One by one they followed. The Torvathi ambassador knelt, and there were those who hissed at him because his people had carried out the cleansing, but he knelt anyway and his mandibles trembled, and he spoke words of shame and commitment that would be debated and analyzed for generations, but that in the moment felt raw and real and true. The Kelasi knelt, and the myriad collective knelt, which was remarkable because the myriad was a hive mind and had never performed an individual gesture in its entire existence. And the Vren and the Salathi and the pale wanderers and species whose names humans could not pronounce, and species so ancient they remembered the Ethan as neighbors. They knelt, empire after empire, civilization after civilization, 4,000 species in the span of hours pledging themselves to a new order built not on power or fear or the machinery of control, but on a principle so simple that a child could understand it, and so difficult that the galaxy had failed to practice it for millennia. You do not abandon the helpless. You do not look away from the fire. Elias Cade was offered a seat on the new assembly, a permanent position with full diplomatic authority, and he sat through the briefing where they explained what the role would entail and nodded at the appropriate moments, and then politely and firmly declined. "I am a salvager," he said. "I fix broken things and I find lost things. That is what I am good at. You do not need me in a council chamber, you need me out there." Vasquez accepted the role on behalf of Earth, and she stood before the assembly and gave a speech that was broadcast to every world. And she did not talk about power or politics or the future of interstellar relations. She talked about a man in a burning building who heard a heartbeat and refused to walk away. And she said that this was what Earth wanted the galaxy to look like, a place where someone always comes. Kale was granted dual citizenship, the last Sithari and the first Sithari Terran, a bridge between a world that was gone and a world that had taken her in. And a memorial was established for the Sithari people, not a statue or a monument but a living archive. Every piece of knowledge encoded in Kale's mind was extracted and preserved and distributed to every library on every world in the galaxy, so that the Sithari would not be remembered as victims but as what they truly were. Seekers of truth who gave everything to make sure the truth survived. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began the slow and messy and painful work of becoming something better. And it was not easy and it was not clean, and there were setbacks and arguments and moments when it seemed like the whole fragile structure might collapse under the weight of its own ambition. But it held, the way things hold when the foundation is solid. And on a quiet afternoon, after the ceremonies and the speeches and the kneeling and the tears, Elias, Cade, and Kale stood on a hill outside Geneva and looked up at a sky that was full of ships from 100 worlds. And the sun was setting behind the mountains and painting everything in gold and orange. And the air smelled like grass and earth, and the particular kind of hope that only exists when you have come very close to losing everything and somehow did not. Kale was taller than she had been when he found her, which was something Mara said was normal for Sithari children who had been under severe stress and then found safety, their bodies catching up all at once like a spring uncoiling, and her burns had healed into silver scars that caught the light in interesting ways, and her bioluminescence was steady and warm. Not the frantic poolsing of fear or the dim flicker of despair, but a constant gentle glow that made her look like she was lit from within by something that could not be extinguished. "Ayla's," she said, and she still said his name that way even though her English was nearly perfect now, because some things you keep the way you first learned them. "Yeah, kid. What happens now?" He looked down at her, at this impossible girl who had survived the death of everything she knew and carried the truth of it inside her mind and given it to the galaxy and changed the course of history before she was old enough to understand what history was. And he thought about all the things he could say. About the new assembly and the rebuilding and the future and the 1,000 challenges that lay ahead. "Now we go home," he said, "and if anyone ever lights another fire, we will be there." She looked up at him, and her violet eyes held something that had not been there when he found her in the ruins of Vathari, something warm and fierce and unbreakable. "Promise. Promise." The drifter's compass lifted off from Earth in the late afternoon light, climbing through the atmosphere and into the star-filled dark, and Mara had already programmed a new course, not to a salvage yard or a trading post, but to Vaith Prime, because Kale had asked to go back. She had asked quietly and without drama, and with the steady certainty of someone who knows exactly what they need to do. Elias had not asked her why, because he already knew. She wanted to plant something in the ashes. The ship turned its nose toward the distant point of light that was Vaith Prime's sun, and the engines hummed with the deep, steady vibration of a heart beating. And in the cockpit there were 2 seats where there had once been one, because Mara had installed a second chair without being asked, sized for a small silver girl who liked to sit with her feet tucked under her and her face turned toward the stars. Behind them Earth grew smaller, a blue and white marble spinning in the dark, the homeworld of a species that had stumbled onto the galactic stage with no army and no empire and no ancient wisdom, armed with nothing but the irrational and magnificent and terrifying refusal to let go of what mattered. And ahead of them the galaxy waited, vast and broken and full of fires yet to be lit and children yet to be found. And somewhere in the endless dark, a man and a girl flew toward the ashes of a dead world to plant something that neither of them had named, but both of them understood. It was the simplest thing in the universe and the hardest, and it was the thing that had brought 4,000 species to their knees. It was the thing that humans call hope.